Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here for Legacies and Lunch, August 2022, a hybrid program of the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Registers-Benden, the outreach coordinator for the Roberts Library, which is where you are right now. The Roberts Library has the galleries and bookstore at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. The Roberts Library Research Room is open Tuesday through Friday from 10 until 5 and every Saturday from noon until 4. A special deal at the Galleries and Bookstore at Library Square. Butler Center books and other gently read Arkansas titles are 50% off on Legacies and Lunch days. So please go take advantage of our great bookstore here. If you want to sign up for our email list, you can, if you're here in person, you can talk to Madeline right over there. Or if you're virtual, you can go to robertslibrary.org and sign up directly. We are not live streaming to YouTube right now. YouTube's not working today, but we will have this program up online on YouTube probably this afternoon. So pretty quickly after the program. Today's speaker will take questions both from the audience here in person as well as folks on Zoom, and I'll be monitoring the chat on Zoom in just a second. Okay. This month we have Ron Fuller, who's going to talk about epitaphs of Little Rock's Mount Holly Cemetery. Originally from Hot Springs, Ron is a former U.S. Army officer and a 3-term member of the Arkansas House of Representatives. He owns a public relations and lobbying firm here in Little Rock. His articles have been featured in the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette and AY magazine. He is the chairman of the board of MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, the Heritage Board of MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, and a member of the Arkansas History Commission. So everybody give a warm welcome to Ron Fuller.
Well, thank you for having me today. Especially appreciate all the people that are online. Shout out to my brother in North Carolina, a few other people. So it's amazing that we're able to do this as long as the technology is working. Thank you for joining me this morning to discuss, well, let me say one more group of people. I know we have some of the ladies who take care of Mount Holly Cemetery. You ladies are absolutely wonderful in what you do to help preserve history. So thank you for joining me to discuss the epitaphs of Mount Holly and to discuss a little bit about preservation of tombstones and historic monuments. We'll talk about that sort of toward the end of my talk. Mount Holly, as most of you know, is located here in Little Rock on Broadway. It's on the south side of I-630. The cemetery dates back to 1843, though there are a few graves and markers that predate the cemetery by some years. Now, interestingly enough, those markers and probably some of the remains were moved from Little Rock's first public burial ground, which was at Capitol Avenue and Gaines Street near the original current federal building. Now, I'm not sure how many of you spend a lot of time in cemeteries or family graveyards. They are absolutely full of history. If you take time to read the inscriptions, you will find that the dead are speaking to us. Not only are they speaking to us, but in many cases, so are the families who placed them so lovingly in Mount Holly and other cemeteries of care. These inscriptions are their voices, and they are speaking directly to us, the living. So before I start my program and kind of get into the meat of it, I want you to hear a few of their voices. Let's put up the first slide. This is the tombstone, gravestone of Mary Watkins. It's one of the more beautiful stones at Mount Holly, I think. Mary lived between 1855 and 1878. Her family were very prominent in Arkansas history and in Arkansas politics. Mary Stone, in the spring of life, a voice called her from this vale of tears to rest with God above. Why sound the note of bitter woe? Why let thine eyes so weep? Our darling lives, O blessed thought. This is not death, but sleep. Obviously, someone very much loved. Let's look at another one here. This is the Rose family crypt. Now, some of you here in Little Rock are very familiar with the Rose Law Firm. There are 4 members in this crypt. It's surrounded by some beautiful foliage. It's really quiet little place. There's a bench very near. But on 2 sides of this crypt, there are a couple of really interesting inscriptions. On one side, but oh, I feel in thee was given a blessing never meant for me. Thou wert too much like a dream of heaven for earthly love to merit me. Mr. Rose speaking to his wife. The other side, which I find really interesting, is why waste such precious wood to make my cross? 4 soft roses for my crown of thorns. Interesting. Number 3 here we'll look at. This is Commodore Perry Wilson. Now, he died at the age of 22, and he was actually not a Commodore. He was a deckhand on a steamboat up out of New Orleans. And the interesting thing about this is he died of cholera. Cholera was everywhere in those days, especially in river towns. Many of you know cholera was brought on by hogs, bacteria, disease, and of course, no antibiotics at the time. So this young man died pretty soon. We have one other monument. There's one other monument in the cemetery that also lists the cause of death, and they list that as murder. So I'll talk about that one in a minute. But talking with, and some of you may know of Abbey Burnett, who's written some really wonderful books on Arkansas tombstones and graves. She tells me there are very, very few instances in tombstones where they actually list the death, the cause of death. But I thought this one was pretty interesting and wanted to share it with you. Now, the next one.
Sorry.
No, that's all right.
Did I go 1 2?
Yeah, you went 1 2. All right. This is Henry Keats Tebow, a young man who died in the Civil War at the Battle of Pilot Knob, which was in Missouri. And actually, it was quite a battle. Beautiful is the death sleep of those who brave the fight in their country's holy quarrel and perish for the right. It's not often you hear the Civil War called a holy quarrel, but obviously the family felt pretty serious about this. Called the Civil War a holy quarrel. Let's look at another one on the Keats plot, and this one really fascinates me. It's Lucretia Keats. Now, this is what her husband said. I laid the sacred laurel wreath, the cedar with its sacred ties, and placed them with a husband's love where my lost Lutie lies. Fresh morning glory buds I twine with scarlet woodbine laid beneath and mingled with a gallatine for my lost Lutie's wreath. Obviously, Lutie was his pet name for his lovely wife, Lucretia. And a gallatine is an Old English word for a rose. Many of you know that in the spring, thanks again to these ladies, there are absolutely beautiful roses surrounding the walls at Mount Holly, and I would encourage you to look at them. They have a lot of longevity too. Even in December, we still seem to have a few out there on the walls. The next one, before I get into the meat of my program, is pretty simple. Little Willie Wilson. No name, no last name, simply a lot of love put into a small cross. Okay. These are but a few, and I'll share a few more, of the thousands of voices that are actually at Mount Holly speaking to us. And you'll hear a few more later. Now, I guess I need to tell you a little bit about how I sort of got into this, so bear with me. History and genealogy come naturally to me as I trace my lineage back to the 1600s. My first ancestor came to America as a Scottish mercenary and a member of a British foot unit during the French and Indian Wars. My family on both sides seems to have always been in somebody's army, at least for the last 8 or 9 generations. My mother jokingly said, it's always because neither side of your family could get along with anybody. Well, years ago, after a stint overseas, I returned to Little Rock as part of the U.S. Army Recruiting Command for a brief period of time. And I fell in love with Mount Holly while I was stationed here in the 70s. I was quite a runner in those days, and I always seemed to find myself running down Broadway and stopping at the gates of this beautiful cemetery. I've always been a lover of preservation and things historical in nature, thanks to my family, so it just fell naturally to me that even though it wasn't my home, I was falling in love with this great cemetery. And little did I know that Mount Holly, some years later, would become a very integral part of my life. So how do you take on a project of creating a database for epitaphs and inscriptions? Why on earth would one do such a thing? In the early 2000s, I was fortunate enough to have an office down here in the River Market, and I started walking at Mount Holly and sometimes taking my lunch there, as sometimes people do. The more I walked and the more I looked at these stones, the more I became intrigued with my love of history at the messages these people were leaving. Now, as we said, I'm a writer of historic and military publications. One individual I found and researched and wrote a couple pieces on at Mount Holly is Captain Benjamin Shattuck. Captain Shattuck was a midshipman on the USS Constitution. Ended up out here in Little Rock after an absence of some 10 years away from the sea. I think he probably was a mountain man and ended up out here in the middle of nowhere in 1831. So I've written a good bit about him, and I don't have his epitaph here today, but if you get to Mount Holly, it's quite an interesting piece. I've also done some research on some World War II people that are Mount Holly, including Lieutenant Calvin Rigner, who I wrote an article for AY on, who perished with the crew of this B-29 during World War II. There's a monument, a little memorial there to him. His mother was a school teacher here in Little Rock. And one of our very famous people here, some of you know, John Netherland Haskell, who was the editor of the Arkansas Gazette for a number of years, very prominent family. He lost a son in World War II, Carrick White Haskell, who died while flying the Hump. Carrick is buried there on with the Haskell plot. Interestingly enough, Carrick was a graduate of Harvard University and classmate of John F. Kennedy. He well could have been a senator or governor had this young man lived. And as you read John Netherland's history, he never got over the death of this prominent son. These men and people are only a small portion of the historic figures, both men and women, who are buried here and deserve to be remembered. I even, in my research that happened here at the Butler Center, I turned up a hanging that took place on the grounds that later became Mount Holly in 1837, before the cemetery was consecrated. Well, kind of back to the history, as I began to look at these stones, and not only at Mount Holly, but some other cemeteries, you can see that in Mount Holly's case, the lettering on many of these stones is filled with 175 years of molds, mildews, and lichens. Nature is simply taking its course. Now, that's not exactly what the people who had these carved and these messages carved so lovingly so long ago would have wanted for their loved ones. Now, at many cemeteries, including Mount Holly, there are ones that you simply can no longer decipher. Fortunately, I'm down to about a handful of them, but I'm still working on them. Weather, both heat and cold, in many cases, ill-advised cleaning and vandalism over the years have taken their toll. This is especially true on monuments that are made of sandstone and soft white granites, which most tombstones, soft white marble, kind of before the advent of granite, which is used primarily on tombstones today and will certainly last a lot longer. When I first started this little project, I was doing it for myself. I said, well, I'm going to write down some of the more memorable ones in a little book and just keep it and enjoy it. Well, as I was walking, I soon found myself only being able to walk about a foot at a time. I would stop, and here's one that was very interesting. So I would record it. And some of them are exceedingly simple. Others catalog lives of great deeds. Some are secular in nature, some are religious. In the last few years, people have begun to use a little more humor in their epitaphs. They're not talking about the afterlife. There's one at Mount Holly that simply says, "Gone fishing." There is another one that is a small brass plaque that's on a relatively modern tombstone. And when I say modern, I'm talking about the 90s, 80s and 90s. It says, "I had a great time. I hope I still am." So I think things have lightened up a little over the years, inscription-wise. All of these that I kept reading intrigued me, and I even decided that the simple ones with names and dates, which were disappearing in many cases, deserve to be noted. Now, I want to say something about Mount Holly, and they have a wonderful website out there if any of you want to Google it up. The indexes of this cemetery are head and shoulders above anything else that I've researched or looked at in Arkansas. Mount Holly, thanks to the work of a lot of people in the past, has even has an index of obituaries of almost all of the people that are buried there. A lady by the name of Kay Tatum, I believe, keeps that. The work that was done years ago and the subsequent work that is done and continues to be done is invaluable to Arkansas history and the families seeking to locate the resting places of our loved ones, of their loved ones. It's probably one of the most photographed cemeteries in the state of Arkansas. Many people refer to it as the Westminster Abbey of Arkansas, and it truly is when you look at some of the artwork and some of the carvings that are there. As I was looking at these epitaphs and kind of recording them in my little book, I was sure that someone in the past had recorded a bunch of the inscriptions. Well, sadly, that wasn't the case. And that is not the case with almost every large cemetery. They have wonderful databases, but for whatever reason, and I guess maybe it was for those epitaphs and inscriptions are so personal sometimes, maybe the registrar, maybe a sexton just decided, well, they're too personal. That belongs to the family. I'm not going to record that. But very, very few cemeteries have a total listing of inscriptions. So how does one start a project like this? Well, you have to be extremely careful around tombstones. Not only has the years covered them with molds, mildews, and lichens, some of the tombstones produced years ago are extremely thin. Some like this, 2-3 inches. They're just small slabs of sandstone, small slabs of very delicate marble, as opposed to the granites that people use today. Years of rain, as I said, and different things have degraded these. So you have to be very careful around these tombstones. Also, if you have any grandchildren and you're out in cemeteries, hold their hands. You do not want children running around pushing over tombstones or having one fall on them. There have in years past, some cemeteries, there have been a couple of children that were actually killed in cemeteries because a big marker fell over on them when they jumped on them. So be careful with that. Now, fortunately, Mount Holly does not allow rubbings on their tombstones. Our sexton and I discussed this, and it's good that they don't. It's good that cemeteries don't, because well-meaning people can push one over. Most of the old stones were set in small bases or on things like this. And so you have to be very, very careful around. Mount Holly has 6,000 markers in that cemetery, not counting a lot of the recent burials, which are in cremations. They're in the columbarium area. Now, as I began to look at these, many of them, as I said, were very difficult to read. I would say what I have reported so far, I feel like we've got about 1,500 tombstones out of the 6,000 that have significant messages about and from the deceased. So what I did is I developed an information sheet, just a plain piece of paper, on which I listed the name, I listed all the pertinent information, the avenue at Mount Holly where this is. I photographed the tombstone from 2 sides, and I put these in a little plastic binder along with the epitaph. Now, currently, I am literally in my office at home up to 9 volumes, alphabetized. But I told the ladies at Mount Holly who I spoke with about this several months ago, that I didn't want them to worry, because if somebody does find me slumped over a tombstone down there, no longer alive, that my wife has very specific instructions to turn these over to the cemetery committee. Hopefully I'll get finished before that happens. Some of these take a good bit of work, and I'll share with you how, and I've been to a couple of classes on cemetery preservation. Like I said, you have to be very careful, but to get the lettering out sometimes on an epitaph, you have to use a small sharpened wooden dowel to edge the molds and the lichens out of the lettering, and keeping in mind, tombstone carvers used a wide array of fonts. And as they have melted over the years, changed, sometimes they are very difficult to read. As I stated, weathering and cleaning methods have eroded and melted some of the lettering and the markings. Sometimes you have to get one word, then you get a sentence, then you get a paragraph. You step back, read it in context, and fortunately, you've got the epitaph. I often use a magnifying glass, and sometimes you have to use a flashlight with the things, depending on the sun and the trees that are above you. You have to use a flashlight to get a little bit of an angle to make sure that you're looking at an I and not an L. And part of the problem is well-meaning people over the years have used caustic chemicals such as bleach, wire brushes to clean their loved ones' stones. There's a kind of an urban legend out there that you should use toothpaste. Well, toothpaste has acids in it and grit. What do you think cleans your teeth? People have used some terrible stuff, Comet, Ajax. Well, if you use these things, and especially bleach, it gets down into the pores of the stone, and all stones are porous. Now, polished granite, not so much nowadays. But the old stones, it gets down into the pores and it eats the stones up inside. Somebody at some point in time worked on Little Willie here. And if you'll notice that yellowing in there, and you'll see that many graveyards and many cemeteries, they scrubbed it with bleach. Instant gratification. It looks beautiful, but it causes the stone to melt from within. So if any of your friends, neighbors, or relatives tell you they're going to go clean a family graveyard with bleach, go take their bleach from them. Don't let them degrade history. Also, the ones that are bleached, you can rub your hand across that and it looks like you've run your hand across a chalkboard. And it's simply the stone degrading from within. Now, the only thing to really use on tombstones is an organic preservative called D2, as in Delta 2, but it's listed on the internet as D2. Have any of you ever heard of that? Great. Well, D2 is an organic chemical preservative. It's organic, fully. It doesn't smell good, so I wouldn't drink it, but it doesn't have a warning on there to tell you not to. D2 works itself into the pores of a tombstone. It eats out years of molds, lichens, and mildews, and once it gets into the pore, and especially marble and sandstone, it builds a little base down in there and does not allow the algae or the mildew to get hold and grow. Unfortunately, it's a little expensive. It's about $60 a gallon. You can buy smaller quantities of it on the internet by Googling it up, and some cemetery organizations will sell it. Now, you run into a few other things. There's a product called Wet and Forget. Use that on your patio. Don't use it in cemeteries. If you read about Wet and Forget, it actually tells you to put a mask and gloves on. So that's pretty acidic stuff. Just don't use that at all, and certainly don't use bleach. I actually think the angels must have come down and sent the D2. The way you use D2, you spray it lightly on the tombstone. You can take a light, soft bristle brush, natural or plastic. You just simply scrub it around. If you're working on an old stone in your family cemetery, put your hand in back of it. Make sure you've got that thing braced up good. Now, big stones are a little different story, but you can use the D2 and then rinse it off. You will be absolutely amazed as hundreds of years just drip off. Sometimes the ones that are the hardest take a couple of applications. You have to brush them again, wash them again. Once you leave, spray another coat of DT on it and simply leave it. D2 works organically. The rain re-energizes it even after it dries. The sun hits it and causes an activation, kind of a magical process. And some stones that now, well, there's stones that were cleaned 10, 15 years ago. I'll show you a couple of stones that with the Steve, our sexton's blessing at Mount Holly, that were cleaned up. You couldn't read them at all. They were totally dark, that were done 4 or 5 years ago. I want to take a few minutes now and share with you. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's run a few before and afters. Some of this D2 stuff. This is a tombstone, and you can see this beautiful flower. There's a, I believe that one has a small enclosure in front of it, maybe like a little flower bed. But that's the way that stone looked prior to being treated with D2. Now, if there's anybody in here that can read the name or the little message that was on this tombstone, I'll give you some more free cookies. Let's look at this after treatment with D2. There's a beautiful, as you can see, there was a beautiful flower that had been carved up top. The inscription here is actually from her sister. That was a piece of white, fine, soft, very elegant marble carved with a lot of love. And now as people walk the lanes there, they can read this. Let's look at a couple more here. This is Sidney Johnson. Well, Sidney was a bright, brilliant young man here in Little Rock. I think he even ran for governor at one point. And Sidney had been affected by black mold, which is the hardest and worst thing to get off. That is a marble inset on a large piece of granite. If you see this in Mount Holly, if you're up there, I can just imagine probably a team of 20 horses pulling a wagon that brought this thing to this cemetery and then had to set it up. Let's look at there's Sidney today. Now, all that was done to Sidney, I didn't even really want to brush Sidney because this is a very delicate inset of marble. So I soaked a rag, and over the last year or two, every time I was at the cemetery, I gave Sidney a little facial rub. And I worked him and I worked him. I did take a little toothbrush and get down in the crevices. And that's the way it looks today. The yellow you see is, there's three or four types of, there's a rust mold, there is in mildew, there's black molds, and then there's a green heavy lichen that grows, once it's just been on a long time, then a lichen starts to build up, and all of you know what that is. And that, if you remove any lichens, you can see where it's really eating into a gravestone. But like I said, I think this D2 was sent by the angels. Okay, let's, all right. I'm going to talk now about a few other people that we have here at Mount Holly that have very unique inscriptions. Samuel Adams, 1823 to 1906. Samuel left his last request on his stone. I want these lines to read when you all stand around my briar. When I am gone, Farewell, my dear children, and the last pang of my life is in parting with you. Wife and 4 children await me long. I will bear then your love in my last parting breath. Your dear old father, Samuel Rankin Addis. He left quite a little note for his relatives. Now, the next one, it's another one I was telling you about, that this is an old one. This one I have not really worked with D2, I haven't swiped it. But this is the other one in the cemetery, like the one in Colorado. This actually says, murdered at Big Rock. This gentleman was a Civil War soldier. He was a member of William E. Woodruff, who was the son of the famous William Woodruff. He was a member of his light artillery battery, fought the Civil War, came back to Little Rock, and Mario Elder ran a tavern and was a barkeep here in Little Rock. Well thought of, nice gentleman. He owned a home on Big Rock. How many of you know where Big Rock is? Big Rock is where Fort Root sits. That was at that time known as Big Rock. So at that point in time, there were farms up there. There were great vineyards and people raising sheep. And Mr. Elder had a farm up there. There was also a very curious hermit that lived up there. And the very curious hermit, from time to time, threatened people who even came on the road by his property. They don't know exactly what happened, but Mr. Elder was found sitting in his chair in his cabin with a gunshot through his head. There was quite an investigation by the Pulaski County Sheriff, and the hermit was arrested. Now, when he was arrested, he said, well, I didn't kill him, but if I did, you'll never get me. Put him in jail. Well, I don't know who his lawyer was, but this guy got out on bail. And he was supposedly pretty much of a nutcase. They let him out of jail on bail, and he lit out for Texas, as the old saying goes, and was never caught or prosecuted. So they never found out who murdered Mario Elder, and he's resting there at Mount Holly. The next one is pretty interesting, and this is Frank Timms. Now, Frank Timms was one of the few victims of what was called the Brooks-Baxter War. Frank, another young man, 1850 to 1871. You start to see a pattern here, lots of young people. He was killed on the steamer Halley. Here's what the inscription says. Died on the boat, the steamer Halley at Palarm, Arkansas, at his post of duty with his face to the foe. Somebody shot him from the bank. They never figured out who shot Frank, but he's resting there at Mount Holly. And the Brooks-Baxter War was, actually fought just up the street here, and quite an interesting little time in Arkansas history. Let's look next at Isaac Wright. Now, this is a young man, died in his prime. This noble boy was the embodiment of all that was beautiful and lovable in childhood, and the hope and promise of all that is good and great in manhood. A grieving mother. Now, the next one is pretty simple. You'll see this on a lot of stones. Peace unto thy ashes. You see a lot of that sort of thing, and a lot of inscriptions. There's one up there that says, stranger trod gently here, loving father sleeps. So lots and lots of touching sentiments. Now, the next one particularly appeals to me, and this is Salome or Salome Dexter. She was the wife of a gentleman who was a preacher, and she was a minister to the Choctaw Indians. Died September 24th, 1852. Look at her age, 21. Missionary to the Choctaws. Now, the next one, this is the grave of William Field Rector. One of the chapters of the UCB has also put a, and I'll show it to you in a minute, it's also put an interpretive plaque on this grave. This gentleman was the son of Governor William Henry Rector, a lieutenant who was killed at the Battle of Helena. He was 20 years old. William, at the time of his death, was adjutant of Hart's Regiment and McCraw's brigade, and was the first man in the entire brigade to ascend the earthworks thrown up by an entrenched enemy at Graveyard Hill. A gallant soldier, rest in peace. Run the next one. That's the other side of Tombstone, son of Governor Rector and Jane Elizabeth Field. There is a large number of people by the name of Field buried there at Mount Holly, including Omar, it's Omar Field, who was one of the first people from Arkansas killed in the Civil War. Okay. All right. This is a particularly interesting stone to me. We have several, there are several there that have the actual likenesses carved of people who are there. There's one that, well, there's about 3 or 4, I think, that are carved like that. But this was Dr. Creighton Peyton. His says, a good man died today, and lo, the angels came and bore him away. He is not here, the angel cried. The Lord hath need of him. He could not here abide. And on the top of this stone, you can't really see up there, it says, the good doctor. Obviously, someone much loved. Now, this is a particular one that I find interesting, being an ex-military guy, and Stephen, who runs the military, MacArthur Military Museum here, and I've talked about this one. This is Lieutenant William Bowman, 1st Regiment of U.S. Dragoons. Died in Little Rock, October 8, 1844, 31 years old. This gentleman is a little bit of a mystery in that the U.S. Dragoons, some of you may or may not know this, the Dragoons were actually mounted infantry. They were not a cavalry unit, they were mounted infantry. And in the early days of Dragoons, just like the Dragoons that you would have seen in Napoleon Bonaparte in early European wars, they carried long pikes, which they could use. Well, that pretty much after firearms, they sort of morphed away from those. But I've done some research on this man's history, and he was originally a sergeant, and the Dragoons basically told the U.S. government they were all going to quit unless they received some of the same benefits and pay and promotions as infantrymen and cavalrymen. They were kind of looked down upon a little bit. But once the government wised up, Sergeant Bowman was promoted to a lieutenant. Now, what makes this interesting, Stephen, what was the year the arsenal was built? 1840. We suspect this gentleman was probably stationed here, died here, subsequently buried at Mount Holly. His history that I can find on him, I don't find any mention of him here, but there is an obituary and it's a letter attesting to his character, and it was printed in the newspaper, and it was signed by the officers that were stationed at the arsenal. But there's no records that exist of who was stationed here from that time. But I would imagine he was stationed here. But it's interesting. I think we've got another fellow who was a dragoon that's also at Mount Holly. Okay, finally, last one I'm going to show you here today is Lulu Page. Now, the Pages have a beautiful plot there at Mount Holly. Lulu lived from 1883 to 1900. A smile has passed, which filled her home with light. Lord, whose beauty made the smile so bright. Let me get back to my original text here. So cemeteries, graveyards are history. They tell a lot about the people who were there, and the people who buried them there have a lot to say about them. I certainly think it's all of our business to work hard and try to preserve these. Now, I will tell you, don't immediately go out and buy a couple of gallons of D2 and go to some cemetery and start cleaning graves. That is not the thing to do. If you are going to clean your family's graves or preserve them, hey, that's a different story. But make sure, if you are involved at all or want to be involved with a historic cemetery, that you seek the guidance of the committees that run those cemeteries. Some of the larger cemeteries, if they are fortunate, such as Oakland and Mount Holly, actually have a sexton, someone who is there pretty much full time and can kind of keep things straight. I would encourage any of you that want to do it. There are wonderful YouTube videos out there on how to clean and preserve monuments. I frankly think it's a it's a labor of love, and it's certainly not easy on some of these hot days that they're bending over. But history belongs to all of us. It's a great opportunity to be a part of something saving history. Now, I'll close by, there's a couple of good websites. As I said, Mount Holly has a beautiful website. There is also, for those of you that do Facebook, and I'm one of the administrators on that site, there's a beautiful website called Arkansas Tombstone Photographs. And you can simply answer a few questions, promising that you'll be a good person and not talk politics or anything on it, as people are wont to do on YouTube. But it has tombstones and monuments on it from literally all over the state. We've got about 10,000 members. We share stuff, we share tips, and it's a great thing to look at. So I'll close up by saying how much I enjoyed being here. Do any of you have any questions? Yes, ma'am. Well, the dragon, we had the war with Mexico. During that time frame, there were units of dragoons down on the Mexican border and involved in that. And dragoons have actually always been a part of the U.S. military until we kind of came along and things turned more to short rifles and small shotguns and that sort of thing. And the guys carrying the long pikes, it just sort of morphed out of the military. Please do. Thank you for coming. Yes, ma'am. Thank y'all so much for coming.
Very interesting.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
These little poems and things, are they commonly used around the United States? Or are they original?
Many of them are original. People wrote poems. People took poems out of books. A lot of them are sayings that are kind of out of print now, that you just don't see much of it. There are a number, if you wish to Google tombstone inscriptions, tombstone epitaphs, there are books on this. There are also books on cemetery monuments and what the meanings of certain carvings are, what the chain links mean, what the roses mean. You'll find ivy on some tombstones that are carved, and that's a symbol of longevity. Ivy was something, as y'all know, you can't get rid of it once it's in your yard. So it was used as that. There are a lot of graves there of children, little lambs that are on top of these children's gravestones. But Mount Holly has some of those beautiful works that if you haven't been there, spend a lot of time, please go, not when it's hot like today, but take a look. And certainly a special thanks to the ladies at Mount Holly who have saved that cemetery over the years and made it such a part of Arkansas history. Nate?
Thank you all for doing this. Is the cemetery still taking burial? I know you got delays.
To my knowledge, and I'm not a member of the committee, that is the purview of our wonderful ladies. The cemetery, to my knowledge, does take remains. It's an active cemetery, and we take, there's a spot back there. You can still buy a spot at Mount Holly. If you wish to join us, the property days never go down. It's a very quiet neighborhood. You can talk to the sextons, you can get on the website, you can call them, and they will sell you a spot in the area where remains are placed. There are a few family burials at Mount Holly. There are some people that bought spots over the years. There are a few places there, it looks kind of odd in some places. You will go through and you'll see, you know, what looks like a big vacant space. There are actual burials there. The cemetery section they have records of those. There were just some people that families, for whatever reason, economically or whatever, and this happens in all cemeteries, just didn't get around to putting up a monument, or the people fell on hard times, and so there are some burials there. I know when I talked to our sexton, I was out there one day when they ran some ground penetrating radar to make sure there were no burials in a certain area there.
Did you say how many graves there are there?
There currently, Steve tells me there's about 6,000 burials, not counting the remains and what have you that are still coming in. And I don't, do any of you ladies know how many burials they had last year? I suspect they had 20 or 30 that were, or more. There were remains and a few family plots. I know many of you knew Richard Butler. He joined the cemetery not too long ago, and Mrs. Worthing, who was a wonderful historian and a great person. She's not too long ago. Any other questions? Well, go out there and support some history. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Ron, for coming and doing this for us. You got a couple of comments on Zoom, mainly thanking you for the bleach warning.
Good.
So you've done good work right there. Please join us next month on September 7th at noon. Suzanne Farr will be here. She's going to talk about her work with the Women's Project and her life in activism. So that should be very interesting. So that's after Labor Day on September 7th. And go take advantage of the deal on the Butler Center titles, Butler Center Books titles, as well as other Arkansas titles in the bookstore. So thanks, everyone.
Try the orange cookies over there.
Yes.
Cranberry orange cookies.
Yes.
That went well.
It did.
Thank you.